As you're looking to develop your own learning philosophy, you are going to spend some time exploring some learning theories to identify where you land, where you align, what fundamental understanding of learning really aligns with your beliefs, or what you hold to be true, and how you can expand on that. So when you start to explore learning theories to help develop your own learning philosophy, you're going to realize that there's a bit of a challenge out there. There's a lot of language issues. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a diversity of information. You've got a broad range of different learning theories, many different names. So what I'm going to try to do is provide a bit of an overview to help you really understand some key fundamentals to help you identify the learning theories that will help you in developing your learning philosophy. So even when I point at a site like this that I'm going to use as an example, there are some issues and there's a bias. So for example, in this particular site, you've got a range. Behaviorism started in the 1900s to, the 1960s, and then you had humanism, then you had cognitivism, then you had yes and no. Yes and no. And the reason I'm saying yes and no is that behaviorism actually had its roots in the actually the 18th, 19th century in Hume's philosophy, empiricism. And so it was based on the notion that we can't know anything about the mind. Behaviorism holds that since we cannot know anything about the mind, the only thing we can do is rely on the senses. And that was sort of a fundamental presupposition provided by Hume. And the behaviorists, who we refer to now as Pavlov and Watson and then Skinner in the 50s and 60s, sort of held to that tradition that since we can't know anything of the mind, the only thing that we can know is what happens in the senses. So conditions, response, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, manipulating different activities, and to see how a person behaves is a way that you facilitate learning, right? Drills, practice, rewards, punishment. That's behaviorism. Now, this table here indicates it started in the 1900s. Yes and no, it had its roots earlier than that. But it was very, very popular, and it's actually still popular today. If you would look at the literature, some would argue that it is still the predominant learning theory that supports a lot of the learning activities that we have today. Our standardized testing that we use today, the competency-based instruction, the skills and drills that we have today are all based on behaviorism, and that hasn't gone away. So when we look at this chart, you'll see that humanism is next, and cognitivism, follows along. Well, both of these ideas really didn't start in the 60s. They've been around for a long, long time, and they go back to the philosophical era of rationalism and existentialism and other ideas. But the notion of humanism is that, as humans, we have this social dynamic. We have experiences that we bring into the relationship, our self-esteem, the way we value things, right? People like Maslow and Carl Rogers, re-establish these ideas. And while they became popular in the 60s, they've been around for a long time. There's a social dynamic to humanism. As people also pushed back on Skinner's behaviorism, the hard behaviorism, we can't know anything of the mind, there was a group of cognitivists who really believed that there were cognitive structures. A lot of the brain research really started to take off in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And now, the neural studies that we have had their roots in the cognitivism of the mid-60s, 70s, and 80s. And so that was sort of a bit of a pendulum swing in reaction to the hard behaviorism. And the argument was that there is this, mind, there's structures within the mind, that we've got this capacity. And they started to view the mind as some type of a computational device that organized and regimented and guided and directed these processes. And so, there's a variety of ideas, different modes of learning and different preferences, all these things, have their roots in cognitivism. And again, the chart says 70s, to 80s. Well, that it continues on to today. Similarly, cognitive constructivism, which this chart would indicate started in the 80s, well, actually it didn't. Cognitive constructivism, or traditional constructivism, really had its roots, you can trace it all the way back to the Stoics in terms of learning by doing. It was the foundation of the whole apprenticeship guild movement in the Middle Ages and even into the Enlightenment and up until now. So at the turn of the 20th century, this would have been referred to as progressivism. And John Dewey would have written about this in 1910 in his book on education. So the roots of constructivism were established. Lev Vygotsky in Russia had been writing about this in the late 19th and early 20th century as well. So constructivism is really rooted in the notion that we learn from experience in the world. We learn by doing. We learn from making meaningful connections, right? It's building on what we know. So we take new things in, we relate it to what we know, and we build new knowledge, right? We construct knowledge, right? And it's a wonderful idea that is based on authentic learning opportunities. So project-based learning, all those wonderful things are related to cognitivism. And because you're relying on the mental structures as well, we tend to call it cognitive constructivism, because the constructivists are very practical people. They will take good elements of what's happening in behaviorism, good elements of what's happening in cognitivism, and they'll take the wonderful elements of social learning theory that Vygotsky and others had talked about, and they'll build those in, which are somewhat humanist elements as well. And so the constructivists really are a group that have their roots, if you want contemporary roots, going back to Dewey, Vygotsky, Jerome Bruner, people like that. Seymour Papert is a classic constructivist. People like that. I also don't want to overlook probably one of the most influential constructivists, and that would be Jean Piaget. Again, and Piaget work was rooted in what Dewey was doing much earlier on. Now, you could trace a lot of that practical, active, dynamic learning right back to the Stoics, as I mentioned earlier. So again, while we see sort of this chart here, the pointing to different dates, these aren't necessarily overly accurate. So today, social constructivism quite often has replaced humanism. We often don't see humanism as one of the big learning theories. Today, most of the bigger learning theories we will see, behaviorism is still there. You'll often see cognitivism. Sometimes it's called cognitive constructivism. And then sometimes you'll see social constructivism because people are recognizing that the constructive influence is quite significant. I would argue that you've got behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism, and I still would rely on the humanistic perspective. And I'm a bit of a classicist in the sense that I see traditional humanism as a more accurate representation than the blend that we see with the social constructivism. So those are the four primary ideas. So this hopefully will give you a foundation as to how these different learning theories have come about and how you can use them to decide what you believe.